Hey there, and welcome to today's Explainer. We're about to go on a seriously incredible journey, tracing exactly how massive, power-hungry, room-sized beasts transformed into the elegant, pocket-sized miracles we all carry around today. Because, this isn't just a basic timeline of gadgets. It's actually the story of how humanity literally learned to harness logic itself. Let's be real for a second. Humans trying to make millions of tiny calculations by hand, that is a total recipe for failure. We get tired, we make mistakes. So who was the very first person to figure out how to teach a machine logic? Like, how do you actually make a pile of cold metal and wires think? Well, the answer to that is the brilliant mathematician Alan Turing. His mind, working way back in the 1930s, is the absolute starting line for this entire technological race. So here's our roadmap for today. 1. Turing's theoretical blueprint. 2. Giant vacuum tube monsters. 3. The tiny transistor revolution. 4. Microchips and the CPU. And finally, 5. Computing for everyone. All right, let's jump into Section 1. Turing's theoretical blueprint, the DNA of digital intelligence. Back in 1936, Turing introduced what we now call the Turing Machine. But here's the wild part. It wasn't even physical hardware. It was a purely brilliant thought experiment. He essentially imagined this theoretical device reading symbols on an infinite piece of tape. And by doing this, he proved a totally radical concept. No matter how impossibly complex a task seems, it can always be broken down into tiny, super simple logical steps. Meaning, a single standardized machine could theoretically solve literally any computational problem out there in the universe. Moving on to Section 2, Giant Vacuum Tube Monsters, World War II and Generation 1. Now, Turing's purely theoretical ideas didn't stay theoretical for long. They violently collided with reality during World War II, right when Britain desperately needed a way to break the notoriously complex German Enigma code. Enter Colossus in 1943. This thing was huge. It took up an entire large room and relied on 1,500 incredibly fragile, glowing glass vacuum tubes just to simulate enemy encryption. And it was a massive success. But because it was a top-secret weapon, it was totally dismantled after the war. That set the stage for a much more public giant, the ENIAC, which made its big debut in 1946. Look, if you thought Colossus was big, ENIAC was a straight-up leviathan. We are talking 30 tons. It sprawled across 1,800 square feet. This machine was just absolute raw electronic muscle, packed to the brim with 18,000 vacuum tubes. Just picture 18,000 hot light bulbs constantly flipping on and off in one room. They drew so much power that there's actually a famous running joke that the city lights of Philadelphia would dim every time ENIAC booted up. But hey, it was fast. It could crunch math in mere hours that would literally take human computers weeks to finish. However, there was a fatal bottleneck here. Sure, ENIAC calculated things at blazing speeds, but actually switching between tasks? Absolute nightmare. To program a new job, operators literally had to stop the entire machine and manually unplug and rewire thousands of cables by hand. Imagine if, every single time you wanted to open a different app on your smartphone, you actually had to physically solder and rewire your phone's internal hardware, which is incredibly tedious, rigid, and ultimately a huge speed bump. So the engineers quickly realized that this physical rewiring was the real speed killer. Teaming up with the brilliant mathematician John von Neumann, they came up with an absolute game changer of a workaround, the stored program concept. The logic was, why physically change the hardware every time when you can just store the instructions electronically in the computer's memory right alongside the data? And this von Neumann architecture is the exact same design philosophy powering whatever device you're watching this explainer on right now. Pretty mind-blowing, right? All right, Section 3, the tiny transistor revolution, solving the heat problem. Okay, so even with stored programs, early computers were still completely shackled by those massive, constantly exploding vacuum tubes. ENIAC needed 18,000 of them, and they popped like hot popcorn, which, as you can imagine, created a massively expensive reliability nightmare. But then, in 1947, Bell Labs hit the jackpot. They invented the transistor. Instead of a fragile glass vacuum tube, this was a hand-sized piece of solid germanium. It generated almost zero heat, used a tiny fraction of the power, and best of all, it didn't shatter. Almost overnight, computers went from taking up an entire building to just fitting neatly inside a large cabinet. Which brings us to Section 4, Microchips and the CPU, Generations 3 and 4. Now, transistors were absolutely amazing, for sure, but they still had to be hand-wired together. It was essentially a giant, messy jigsaw puzzle that put a hard limit on just how small these machines could actually get. Then, in 1958, engineers cracked a solution that sounds, honestly, practically like magic: photolithography. Instead of painstakingly wiring everything by hand, they figured out how to use light to project and print these incredibly detailed wiring patterns directly onto a silicon wafer. It was a lot like developing a photograph in a darkroom. This breakthrough meant they could mass-produce millions of microscopic switches all at once. Just like that, the era of hand wiring was dead, and computers shrank right down to the size of a typical office desk. Then, in 1971, Intel took this whole concept one massive step further. See, before this, the central processing unit, the CPU, was this huge, clunky circuit board scattered with dozens of different chips. But the Intel 4004 managed to cram all of that scattered hardware onto one single, tiny microchip. This one chip acted as the true brain of the computer, handling all the calculations, the logic, and the control signals. By putting the entire brain on a single, affordable, portable little chip, the fourth generation of computing was officially born. Because of that single chip breakthrough, our world changed seemingly overnight. We shifted at lightning speed from these multi-million-dollar institutional mainframes right down to scrappy garage inventions. In 1975, the Altair 8800 kit completely captured the public's imagination, actually inspiring a couple of guys to found a little company called Microsoft. By 1976, Jobs and Wozniak had cooked up the Apple I. And then, in 1981, IBM released their iconic personal computer, which cemented the whole Wintel standard. Suddenly, for the very first time, computing was personal, and more importantly, it was affordable. And that leads us perfectly to Section 5, Computing for Everyone, the Graphical Revolution. So, we finally had affordable desktop PCs. But let's be honest, they were still deeply intimidating for the average person. Early machines required you to type out these cryptic text commands into a blank, glowing screen, and the learning curve was just incredibly steep. The final piece of the puzzle was the Graphical User Interface, or GUI. This was commercialized beautifully by the 1984 Apple Macintosh, and it basically replaced those scary lines of code with the universal language of pictures. I mean, instead of memorizing a string of commands to delete a file, you just used a mouse to drag a cute little visual icon directly into a trash can. That one design shift made computing intuitively easy for everyone, from artists to students to your grandma. And, well, that brings us to today. We've seen exactly how the relentless quest for smaller, cooler, and easier-to-use machines literally built our entire modern world. We went from Alan Turing's theoretical infinite tape to those giant, glowing vacuum tubes, all the way down to tiny, printed silicon brains. Our entire digital life right now totally relies on the billions of microscopic transistors packed onto modern microchips. But, as we know, technology never, ever stops evolving. So I want to leave you with one final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. We have shrunk these switches down to almost the atomic level at this point. We're literally running out of physical room. So, what giant leap comes next? What crazy invention is finally going to replace the microchip? Thanks so much for exploring this incredible history with me today. Catch you next time.